Queens do not usually cry at their own weddings. But as Amara stood at the altar of a stiflingly quiet church, heavy tears rolled freely down her cheeks, staining her pristine white lace gown. Her hands trembled as she held her bouquet, standing beside a man the guests were actively trying not to look at. He wore no designer suit, no gold watch, just a faded dark jacket and a dusty gray flat cap. Whispers hissed through the wooden pews. Is this the groom? What happened to the rich one? In the front row, Madame Veronica didn't whisper. She smacked. Dripping in heavy gold jewelry and an opulent red and gold wrapper, Amara's wicked stepmother crossed her arms in absolute triumph. This was her masterpiece. Just weeks ago, Amara was engaged to Brian, a man of flashy cars and endless promises of luxury. But Veronica, blinded by greed, couldn't stand the thought of her stepdaughter outshining her own biological daughter, Esther. So she rewrote the future. She broke the engagement, pushed Esther into the rich man's arms, and dragged Amara to the altar to marry a jobless street rat, ensuring the beautiful, kind-hearted girl who had scrubbed her floors for years would be trapped in poverty forever. Stop your crying, wretched girl, Madame Veronica had hissed, just moments before the ceremony. My Esther will take the luxury you tried to steal. Amara didn't fight back. She had learnt long ago that silence was the safest way to survive her stepmother's cruelty. She simply turned her tear-filled eyes back to the altar, accepting her tragic fate. The guests thought they were witnessing the ultimate defeat. Madame Veronica thought she had won the ultimate prize. But everyone in that room was missing one crucial detail. The poor groom beside Amara didn't look ashamed. He didn't look defeated. Beneath the brim of his dusty flat cap, his eyes held a quiet, dangerous patience. It was the patience of a billionaire in disguise, and he was about to turn Madame Veronica's empire of lies into ashes. 3 weeks before the tear-stained wedding, the air outside Madame Veronica's compound was thick with the scent of exhaust and newly minted wealth. A gleaming, midnight black Mercedes-Benz glided to a halt before the rusted gates, its heavy engine purring loudly enough to command the attention of the entire street. Out stepped Brian. Draped in a crisp, tailored suit and sporting dark sunglasses, he looked every inch the millionaire he claimed to be. He had come for Amara. Striding into the modest yard, Brian didn't just walk, he paraded. He carried shopping bags bursting with imported silks and casually flashed thick stacks of crisp currency, tossing notes to the neighborhood children who had gathered to stare. His voice boomed as he made grand, sweeping promises, speaking of palatial estates in the city, endless vacations, and a future where Amara's hands would never have to touch a scrubbing brush again. Amara, standing quietly on the veranda with a broom in hand, simply lowered her eyes, overwhelmed and unsure of this sudden storm of extravagance. But Madame Veronica did not hesitate. Standing at the doorway, Veronica's eyes locked onto the glossy shine of the Mercedes like a hawk spotting prey. To her, Brian wasn't a suitor, he was a golden ticket out of mediocrity. Her breathing shallowed as a wicked, calculating hunger took root in her chest. She watched him carelessly toss a heavy bundle of naira onto a plastic table just to clear some space. From behind the window curtain, her biological daughter Esther watched with eyes wide with naked envy. In that single glittering moment, completely blinded by a wolf draped in borrowed luxury, Veronica made a silent, ruthless vow. That wealth would never belong to the stepdaughter she despised. The very night Brian's taillights faded down the dusty street, Madame Veronica went to work. The poison of jealousy had already crystallized in her heart, leaving no room for conscience. She cornered Amara in the cramped, dimly lit kitchen, her voice dripping with venom masquerading as maternal concern. "You think a man with that kind of wealth wants a housemaid?" Veronica sneered, snatching a wet rag from Amara's trembling hands. "He pities you, Amara. He told me himself. He needs a wife who knows how to host politicians and billionaires, not a girl whose hands constantly smell of bleach and firewood. You will only embarrass him." Amara's gentle heart, already bruised by years of relentless psychological torment, easily fractured under the weight of her stepmother's calculated cruelty. When Brian returned the following afternoon, Veronica intercepted him at the gate. With crocodile tears and honeyed lies, she span a wicked tale of Amara's supposed secret infidelities and ungrateful nature. "She only wants to drain your wallet," Veronica whispered, patting Brian's arm. "But my Esther has admired you from afar. She is refined. She is truly ready to be the queen of your empire." Brian, a desperate opportunist playing a dangerous game of pretend, didn't actually care which sister he took. He only needed to secure a naive, compliant bride to complete his wealthy facade before his employer discovered the missing cars. He eagerly shifted his grand promises to the vain stepsister. Within days, Esther was parading around the compound in the imported silks originally meant for Amara, clinging to Brian's arm with a smug, triumphant grin. Meanwhile, Amara was banished back to the shadows, washing the dishes used for her sister's lavish new engagement, her dreams casually crushed beneath her stepmother's gold-heeled slippers. Even with the engagement broken, Madame Veronica's paranoia festered like an open wound. She knew Amara's breathtaking, effortless beauty was a quiet threat that could eventually outshine Esther's stolen prize. To completely extinguish any hope of a rival, Veronica needed to bury her stepdaughter's future in inescapable poverty. She needed a pawn, someone so utterly wretched that Amara could never dare to hold her head high again. The opportunity presented itself near the towering gates of a wealthy estate across town. There, leaning casually against the brick wall, was a man in a dusty, faded dark jacket and a worn grey flat cap. He looked every bit the jobless street rat Veronica was hunting for. She approached him with a haughty sneer, offering him a meager sum of cash to take a burden off her hands. The man, who introduced himself simply as Elijah, didn't argue. He only offered a quiet, penetrating stare that Veronica blindly mistook for the dumb obedience of a hungry beggar. Returning home, Veronica delivered the final, crushing blow. She threw a cheap, second-hand white lace dress onto Amara's thin mattress. "You are getting married this weekend," Veronica commanded, her voice slicing through the thick air of the tiny room. "Since you are so eager to leave my house, I have found a husband suitable for your station, a street beggar for a maid." Amara wept, her heart finally shattering into dust, but there was no one left to fight for her. Trapped, isolated and terrified, she was forcibly dragged toward a hasty, degrading union, entirely unaware of the massive storm quietly gathering beneath her new groom's silent, unbothered demeanor. The heavy wooden doors of the church swung open, spilling the wedding party out into the harsh afternoon sun. The stifling ceremony was finally over, sealing two entirely different fates. Madame Veronica stood on the church steps, her chest puffed with absolute triumph as she watched her masterpiece unfold. To her right, Esther twirled in a lavish designer gown, laughing loudly as Brian opened the door to a gleaming, ribbon-draped Mercedes-Benz. They slipped into the plush leather seats, speeding off toward what Esther fully believed would be a sprawling palatial estate. Veronica waved them away, her greedy heart soaring at the thought of her biological daughter inheriting the world. To her left stood a brutal, heartbreaking contrast. Amara remained frozen on the gravel, her delicate white lace gown catching the dust of the departing luxury car. The tears that had started at the altar now flowed silently, carving tracks of profound grief down her cheeks. She had no grand exit. There was no convoy, no fanfare, not even a beat-up taxi waiting to carry her away. Beside her, Elijah adjusted his faded grey flat cap. He didn't speak to the whispering guests or acknowledge Veronica's victorious, mocking sneer. Instead, he simply reached out, his hand gently guiding Amara's trembling arm. With quiet, unbothered dignity, the jobless street rat led his terrified, weeping bride away on foot. As they walked down the dusty road toward an entirely unknown destination, Amara's heart pounded with dread. The gleaming Mercedes-Benz glided smoothly through the affluent neighborhoods of the city, carrying Esther and Madame Veronica toward what they believed was absolute paradise. As the car approached the towering, wrought-iron gates of a breathtaking private estate, Veronica's chest puffed with pride. She had done it. She had secured an empire for her blood, effectively destroying her stepdaughter in the process. But as the heavy gates swung open, the fairy tale abruptly shattered. Brian didn't drive up the sweeping, palm-lined driveway toward the palatial main house. Instead, he sharply veered the vehicle down a narrow, unpaved service road, hidden behind a thick row of hedges. The car bumped along the rough dirt, eventually jolting to a halt in front of a cramped, dingy row of concrete buildings. A faded clothesline stretched across a narrow porch, displaying worn uniforms. "Brian, what is the meaning of this?" Veronica demanded, her voice sharp with rising panic. "Why are we at the servants' quarters?" Brian killed the engine, his millionaire swagger completely evaporating. He refused to meet her eyes, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This is my house," he muttered, the grand illusion finally breaking. Esther let out a blood-curdling shriek, her lavish designer gown suddenly looking absurd against the backdrop of peeling paint and rusted gutters. "Your house? You said you owned the estate." "I drive for the man who owns the estate," Brian snapped, fear bleeding into his voice. "I borrowed the cars while the boss was away. I thought I could figure out the money later." Madame Veronica stumbled backward, the heavy gold jewelry around her neck suddenly feeling like a suffocating noose. Her triumphant masterpiece had just collapsed into dust. She had broken Amara's heart, only to hand her own daughter a crown of lies. Amara's feet dragged along the dusty shoulder of the road, her vision blurred by relentless tears. She braced herself for the squalor her stepmother had condemned her to, fully expecting Elijah to lead her into the heart of the city's unforgiving slums. But the air around them began to shift. The crowded, noisy streets faded behind them, replaced by a smooth, pristine access road lined with towering palm trees and heavy security checkpoints. Miraculously, the heavily armed guards simply bowed and waved them through without a single word. Suddenly, the narrow path opened up to a sprawling, sun-drenched tarmac. Amara stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching sharply in her throat. Sitting majestically on the runway was a sleek, gleaming private jet, its engines humming with quiet, terrifying power. A row of uniformed staff stood at strict attention near the boarding stairs, waiting. Amara trembled, instinctively stepping back. "Where are we? Elijah, please!" Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stopped walking, reached up, and slowly pulled the dusty grey flat cap from his head. As the faded fabric was discarded, so too was the illusion of the destitute street rat. His hunched, unassuming shoulders squared and straightened, expanding into the sharp, commanding posture of a man who owned the world beneath his feet. The quiet, passive gaze that Madame Veronica had so easily mocked transformed in an instant, revealing the piercing, unbothered confidence of a billionaire tycoon. A man in a crisp suit hurried down the steps of the jet, bowing deeply. "Welcome back, sir. We are ready for takeoff." Amara stared in absolute shock. The man her stepmother had thrown her to wasn't a pawn, he was the king. Amara could not formulate a single word. Her breath hitched as she stared at the man she had just sworn her life to. Elijah gently reached out, his hands steady and warm, and guided her up the steps into the plush, leather-scented cabin of the jet. once the heavy doors sealed them inside, shutting out the roar of the engines. The silence between them hung thick with unasked questions. "I am not the man your stepmother thought she was throwing you away to," Elijah finally spoke, his voice rich, steady, and commanding. He poured her a glass of water, offering it with a soft smile. "My name is Elijah, and the man who just drove off with your stepsister in my Mercedes-Benz is my chauffeur, Brian." Amara gasped, her hands shaking so violently she nearly spilled the water. "Your chauffeur?" Elijah nodded, his eyes darkening with a mixture of pity for her past and quiet fury for her abusers. Weeks ago, his security team had alerted him that Brian was taking his luxury vehicles off the estate to play the role of a wealthy suitor. Intrigued and cautious, Elijah had followed him to Madame Veronica's gates, disguised in the faded jacket and dusty cap. What he witnessed there changed everything. He saw Veronica's grotesque greed, Brian's foolish lies, and Esther's vain entitlement. But amidst all that poison, "I saw you," Elijah whispered, leaning closer. "I watched you scrub those floors with quiet dignity. I saw your enduring kindness, your gentle grace even when they broke your heart and treated you like death. I didn't let your stepmother force this marriage, Amara. I orchestrated it. I was looking for a queen with a pure heart, and I found her." The peeling walls of the cramped servants' quarters echoed with the shrill, unbroken wails of Esther. Madame Veronica paced the tiny, unair-conditioned room, her heavy gold jewelry clanking like the chains of a prisoner. She hurled vicious insults at Brian, who sat hunched on a stained mattress, his head buried in his hands. The grand illusion of wealth had evaporated, leaving behind a suffocating reality of disgrace. "You useless fraud," Veronica shrieked, striking Brian's shoulder with her expensive handbag. "You promised my daughter a mansion. Where is the owner of this estate? I will tell him his driver is a thief." Brian looked up, his eyes bloodshot, a hollow, bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You already met him." Veronica froze, her hands suspended in the air. "What nonsense are you spewing?" "The estate owner, the billionaire," Brian spat out, the sheer absurdity of the situation finally breaking his spirit. "He is the man you paid to marry your stepdaughter, Elijah." The silence that followed was deafening. The blood completely drained from Veronica's face, leaving her a sickly ashen grey. Esther, sobbing, abruptly hitched in her throat, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "You lie," Veronica whispered, though her trembling knees betrayed her sudden, crushing terror. "He followed me," Brian confessed, his voice trembling with defeat. "He saw me taking his cars to your house. He disguised himself as a street beggar to test you. And you practically handed Amara the keys to his empire just to spite her." The staggering weight of the truth collapsed onto Madame Veronica like a falling building. The street rat she had used to curse her hated stepdaughter was a king. In her wicked greed, she had crowned Amara while condemning her own flesh and blood to the death. Desperation drove Madame Veronica to do the unthinkable. Dragging a weeping Esther by the wrist, she abandoned the dingy servants' quarters and rushed toward the private airstrip, her heavy gold jewelry clanking frantically against her chest. When she arrived, the deafening roar of the jet's engines was already spooling up. There, standing gracefully on the boarding stairs, was Amara. The cheap, second-hand white lace gown she had been forced to wear now looked like the royal attire of a queen, glowing against the backdrop of unimaginable wealth. Beside her stood Elijah, the billionaire king she had unknowingly married. Veronica collapsed onto the unforgiving tarmac, the harsh dust coating her expensive red and gold wrapper. "Amara, my sweet daughter," she shrieked, the venom of her past completely replaced by the pathetic whimper of a defeated beggar. "Forgive me, I was only trying to protect you. Please do not leave your family in the dirt." Esther fell to her knees beside her mother, sobbing bitterly for the stolen luxury that was never hers to begin with. Amara paused on the stairs and looked down. For years, she had cowered beneath this woman's shadow, accepting every cruel insult and backbreaking chore in absolute silence. But as she looked at her wicked stepmother kneeling on the runway, Amara felt no anger, nor did she feel the need for revenge. She only felt an overwhelming, liberating sense of peace. She did not offer a grand speech or a hateful curse. Instead, Amara offered a soft, pitying smile. It was the ultimate, devastating victory. She turned gracefully, taking Elijah's outstretched hand, and stepped into the plush cabin. As the heavy doors sealed shut and the private jet soared into the boundless sky, Madame Veronica was left weeping on the desolate runway, choking on the bitter, suffocating ashes of her own phenomenal greed. The truth always finds its way to the light, even if it has to arrive wearing a faded jacket. If this story of ultimate karma kept you gripped until the very last second, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Here at Tales of the Nomad, we bring you emotionally charged, cinematic stories every single week. Drop a like, share this with someone who loves a good story of justice, and subscribe to become part of the family.